Just thank you, Michael and Christina and the whole team for inviting me, and thank you to all the participants for coming along to the talk. And I also, by way of apology in advance, but also I hope giving some hope for an interesting discussion. I am very much a political philosopher and a bit of an armchair person, so I don't have any practical expertise in the field, either as an activist or as a fundraiser. So I'm really, really curious how all of you might connect with what I say, because I'm going to give some very general ideas about what I think democracy is and what I think are its key problems today. I should also say, for anyone who's sort of looked at any of my work, although in my book I talk about Japan, I was born in Japan and grew up there. And so I kind of started off with this international perspective and then have ended up just living in various places. What I'm going to say about the kind of core of democracy has more to do with the sort of crisis everyone's talking about of Western liberal democracies today. So that's the focus. But I think I'll be curious if you think some of the general ideas I have about what democracy should be worrying about, what we should be worrying about as people who want to support democracy, and what should we do about it, how that connects with the context that you work in. So I'm going to switch now to my screen sharing and go for it. And here we are with can you all see that? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, hang on, I got it. Let me go to my
yeah, if you can put it on
slideshow. Yes, slideshow. Where's my slideshow? It's all kind of cramped in the corner here. Yay, there we are. Right. So democracy without models. that's my big question, because yeah, I mean, as we know, everyone at the moment is a bit concerned about the old model democracies that used to be upheld as what everyone in the world who wanted a democracy should be aspiring to get. And right now we're seeing the US in obvious straits. We're seeing UK tearing itself apart, and everyone is asking this question of, what's happened to our models? Do we still have any? If so, what are they? Do we just pick and choose from, a bit of Norway, a bit of Iceland, a bit of South Africa, a bit of different places all around the world? Or do we need to kind of go back to some sort of basic, back to the drawing board in some respect as well? And to my thinking, a lot of the basics we get are not necessarily positive ones. They're also about things you can avoid. So when I'm talking about models, you'll notice that a lot of the models I'm thinking about are not ideal ones. They're kind of examples that we need to look at throughout history, and also in different countries, to see what we need to avoid. And maybe some philosophical thoughts too are very basic to democracy. And if so, what are those basics? Hang on. Why isn't it switching? My slideshow isn't. Okay, there we are. Well, one thing I'm not going to say is the old saw, let's go back to ancient Greece. Ancient Greek models are the best. No, I don't think that at all, except in the way that I just said, that some of the ancient Greek examples we get actually show you what not to do. And sometimes in the history after that, people have avoided the things that ancient Greeks did wrong, and sometimes they've just fallen into the same traps. My book has a lot about that. This is the guy called Pericles. You may recognize him, who was the leader of the Athenian democracy at a very crucial time in its history. And you find this passage in a book by Thucydides, an ancient Greek historian, who says that Pericles declared Athens' democracy is a school for all Greeks. And he upheld it as the best possible form of government and praised it effusively. So a lot of us nowadays think, that must be, there must have been a lot to that. Well, actually, he gives this speech in the context of a war which Athens launched in a bid to dominate all of Greece. And it was basically a bold-faced imperialist war, which Athens lost terribly in the most humiliating way. So, and Thucydides, the historian, frames his whole history with this idea of hubris, that, the democracies are very fond of equality. They're very fond of talking about freedom, but is that freedom and equality for everybody? Or is there kind of a hubris that's run through a lot of formerly powerful democracies that we need to kind of look out for. And what we're seeing today, fast forward to 2020s, and this is just a little small passage of something you find on the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China, where I occasionally go and do work. And these are just a few things that this propaganda page says about the state of American democracy specifically. I won't read them all, but entrenched racism, widening wealth gap, freedom of speech in name only. It goes on and on. And unfortunately, it's not just China, the big rival right now of the United States that has these doubts. You find similar doubts within democracies inside Europe, also in the US itself, and inside Europe, notably Viktor Orban in Hungary, whose country is a member of the European Union, has declared that Hungary is an illiberal democracy and put the democracy in Hungary sort of at odds with the models of liberal democracy that have kind of claimed to know what to do in the past. So this idea that democracy can still be democracy but be illiberal is an interesting question. But it definitely kind of highlights the crisis of democracy today. So, many of you are interested in Latin America, Africa, other parts of Asia. There is this question of how do we make it up from scratch now? What do we do? This is just, I've been particularly interested in Central and Eastern Europe and lived in Poland and Hungary for several years at a time when there was a sudden, soon after the fall of the wall in Europe, when then multi-party systems and free market systems were introduced with the very strong support from the US and Western Europe. And in 2019, that's 20 years after 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was this Pew research poll that said that, most people were sort of happy that they did switch to this democratic system and to the free market system, but many also had very strong criticisms and deep disappointments of what's happened in the process of democratization after communism. So nearly half of people across these countries said that changes had a negative impact on healthcare, law and order, and family values. Many people thought that politicians and business people in particular benefited a lot more than ordinary people. And a median across all the countries where people were interviewed said politicians benefited a great deal or considerably from changes in their country. 80% said the same of business people. Only 41% said ordinary people benefited from turning towards a kind of liberal free market democracy. So this is giving you a sense of how it didn't turn out as well as people thought. And then, of course, what we didn't expect back in 1989 was that these, the same kind of reservations about the change towards a liberal democratic system would also arise in our own countries to the extent that they have. When I lived in Poland in the mid-1990s, nobody really expected that the same kind of doubts my Polish friends and students and colleagues were having about a liberal free market economy, about the kind of deep challenges to their traditional values, would take off and become such a political force in America or in Western Europe. I mean, these concerns did exist, but they didn't have movements that were so organized as they've become. So there's a kind of big question of how did we get here that we're all asking now across Western countries in particular. And one of the narratives that I find, that we all hear over and over again is democracy is kind of subverted primarily by authoritarian leaders, people who want more power. And then they've got their henchmen in the media and in business who also collaborate to try to kind of steal democracy away from the people. I kind of am getting a bit concerned that this democracy versus authoritarianism narrative is telling, only part of the story. It's the tip of the iceberg. And what we really need to do to kind of tackle democracy and also understand what you need to do in countries that are sort of new to democracy or struggling to establish it is to kind of look a bit deeper. what I kind of argue in the book, without making a very explicit argument, I want people to kind of see how it works out for themselves by reading the book in different contexts. But gaps in wealth and other forms of kind of power inequality, you know, and precarity actually kind of create opportunities for authoritarianism. And I think we need to really focus on this relationship between the political, what we think of as the political, often the institutions and the leaders, what we often think of as democracy, but also economics. Economics is part of democracy too. If we forget that, we're going to kind of just have a superstructure, and I'm not necessarily a Marxist, but I think that concept works very well, a superstructure, but what goes on between, you know, behind the scenes and underneath will still erode it. And, you know, there's also, I think nowadays, one of the big problems we're seeing, and it does affect voting, is the pandemic, the, you know, climate crisis, wars. You know, all this is creating a sense of an end of the world precarity among people of all generations that's sort of heightening this sense of threat, and also helps authoritarians who say, we'll look after you, we'll fight the enemy. The enemy is something else, and we'll deal with it, or that minimize something like the climate crisis and try to kind of dismiss it. I also want to say, I mean, we often think in this narrative of authoritarians versus democracy that there's a deliberate power grab going on. And I think that is often the case in a lot of the countries that maybe some of you are working in, that you have a kind of fragile situation where most of the people are actually have very little power at so many levels. Unlike in Western democracies, where we have a lot of comfortable people, relatively comfortable people who are still feeling quite vulnerable. But the power grab thing is not happening as much, I think, in Western liberal democracies until we've already reached a certain crisis point, until things have gone really bad in society. So I think one has to kind of, if you think any of what I'm saying here makes some sense, you do have to adapt it from one situation to another. Because a lot of the inequalities and precarities that we see often are not created by anyone deliberately. You know, they grow up inadvertently through the, you know, ordinary process of having some sort of market economy. Even a quite regulated market economy like Sweden can still develop some quite serious forms of inequality, and it has, which at some point, to everyone's surprise, results in an election that returns quite a semi-far right or friendly with far right government to the country, or the Netherlands, same sort of problem. So it's, but my main point in my book is kind of to try to get us to all focus on the little small inadvertent things that can happen all the time within democracies that undermine its capacity to defend, or our capacity to defend it. It's because we're taking the eye off the ball quite often. And these are just some of the ways that I think the eye gets taken off the ball. And it did, you know, in the case of Poland and a lot of places in the former Eastern Bloc countries. In terms of economics, you know, it was assumed for a long time that democracy and private profit, you know, driven market economies go hand in hand. That was the assumption of the people who are sponsoring a lot of this democratization. In terms of culture, and here's a tricky one that many of you probably have quite interesting things to say about. There was this assumption among the Western people sponsoring Eastern democratization that strong nationalism and ethnic politics are somehow like relics of a bygone era of old-fashioned underdevelopment, tribalism. You know, that it wasn't going to happen at home. It wasn't going to happen to the West. The Western nationalism they thought of as being like very moderate, perhaps constitutional. We have the sort of nationalism that that supports our liberal constitutions and is proud of the fact that Americans have this great constitution, or Britain does, while the East has ethnic nationalism. Well, it doesn't really look like that anymore in lots of Europe and even in the US. Nationalism has become something much less moderate in some circles. So these are things that we need to pay attention to. And then finally, there was always this assumption up till, you know, for a long time, that Western leadership is needed to help sustain democracies in other countries and across the globe. Now, not just assistance and collaboration, working together with partners who are trying to support democracy elsewhere, but actually taking the kind of guiding role, teaching people what to do and making conditional on doing it our way, part of the package. And it was assumed also that liberal democratic models are universally exportable and existential threats to democracy don't happen here. So that's a big question for me is, what about this Western leadership? Is that something we, really still need? Think about. Just to kind of run through that, I mean, I think, this is summarizing what I've said in a way, but I think here's a kind of slightly different point about democracy being confused with liberalism for a long time in the West. And and accepted, and a lot of people in the West accepted or got used to very weak regulation in their economies and hyper competition for goods like education. Everyone's out there fighting and fighting to get best education for their kids, even when they're voting Democrat or for a left-wing party. They're involved in this hyper competition all the time and didn't sort of realize that they themselves were contributing to this crisis, perhaps by not saying, hang on, maybe we should vote to kind of control this competition in some ways. I think a lot of people were too complacent about inequalities and precarity in our midst, whether or not we experienced it ourselves, but particularly the ones who are relatively comfortable and, again, often voting for left-wing parties or for the Democrats, however they are, we're still a bit complacent. And we just failed also to notice on a global scale how much people everywhere are basically vulnerable to the same strains. We are all the same kinds of people. Different systems and different histories are going to make us express our conflicts in different ways and have more or less difficulty in establishing stable, firm democracies. But in the end, even we, with this long-lasting, wealthy and powerful democracies, ended up being very vulnerable, which has huge consequences for the rest of the world. Now, I'm going to take a tiny little short excursion back to history and then wrap up pretty soon after that. But this is where I think trying to go back to what I call basics, and these are philosophical basics which I find in history, can be kind of a useful way to try to get a bigger picture on what's going on. There's an ancient theme in ancient Greece, and it was passed on to the Romans when Romans established a popular government, a republic, that when democracies go corrupt, what you've got to do is go back to the beginnings. And that doesn't mean go back and do everything like your ancestors did. It just means go back and look at big questions like, why did they choose democracy in the first place? If democracy is so flawed, why do we still kind of think, well, that's what we want anyway? That's the situation we're in now in 2024. Lots of people see that it's a mess in its really existing exemplars, but lots and lots of people still really want it. Why is that? What went wrong in the past? What were the weak spots? And were they there all along? Was democracy something that was kind of golden and fantastic, and then it just suddenly exploded, later on, or it exploded because of some authoritarians? Or were there sort of seeds that were always there that we have to kind of take care of and keep an eye on? And is it still better than the alternatives? So there's before, I mean, this is going back to the oldest founding story in ancient Greece that you find, and it has to do with a guy called Solon. Before Athens acquired what its founders called democracy, the main political fault line, the ancient Greeks say, was rich versus poor. It wasn't people versus tyrants. There were rich and poor people, and they started fighting. Then at some point, facing very, extremely violent revolts, the plutocrats got tired and they asked Solon to come and legislate a peace among the populace. And Solon, whose job was to mediate, created these new laws that managed to kind of limit economic inequalities. That was his main aim. And he saw that as the basis of political stability, that, economics and politics are like that. If you try to separate them into public and private, you're going to, stoke up trouble for later. He created basic social protections, especially towards people who found themselves in debt, who were being really badly exploited by the rich. He stimulated new trades, redistributed some property, gave more political rights to the less wealthy. Now, all that sounds great, but what's interesting in the Greek version of the story is it wasn't, oh, and then they all lived happily ever after. No, it ends kind of badly because Solon does all that and then he disappears because he says, I'm going to leave you now to deal with it yourselves. It wasn't full democracy. Ordinary people didn't have full political equality. And soon the New Deal failed. The plutocrats went back to exploiting the other people. And then the other people went to doing what vulnerable people always do. They backed a tyrant. And the tyrant promises to fight their corner. Heard that story before. Then there's yet another twist because you get this warning right there. But then there's this new twist that within a couple of generations, the tyrants are so bad that a group of people stand up to them and topple them. And when they did that, they realized two things that led them to create democracies and decide that democracy was the best kind of government. And I think these two reasons still hold. First of all, very unequal societies are less stable, productive, and humane than those where inequalities are held in check. And second, you can't trust a single class or party to do the checking in a way that seems fair to all. That was the point that Solon didn't quite get. He didn't take that step of giving full equality to all the Athenian males, such that you could really have a democratic oversight of what the powerful were doing, the economically powerful were doing. So this turned into the basis for Athenian democracy. And the reformers not only created institutions that forced all the citizens to sit together and deliberate matters of policy, but also made sure that there were kind of social protections for everybody and some economic equality on a, up to a point. It was a balance. So, I mean, this is, my view of democracy, this is how I see it. It's a power sharing scheme. That's the point of democracy. It's not, democracy is about freedom. Democracy is about fighting against tyranny. Democracy in a more positive way should be a power sharing scheme that's designed to check dangerous and unjust gaps in power, including wealth. That's how I would sum it up. It's not, democracy is a power sharing scheme. Oh, that sounds very nice, but what about all these people who are constantly undermining it? It's democracy is a power sharing scheme where you have this built-in warning about the dangers, the tensions, the suspicions that are built into people power. That's what I see as the vulnerability of people power, that people power isn't all, here we are all together being happy. No, people power is like got natural suspicions of somebody else trying to take more than their share. Because any power sharing scheme, you're going to have some people who want to take more than their share. It sounds brutal. It sounds brutally realistic, but why not? We're human. We can admit that we're like that. And this is what the ancients did that I like so much, that they admit that human nature has these, features that render us occasionally not, terribly nice to our fellow human beings, that make us want to be more equal than others. But if we're in a democracy, we've got to agree that those tendencies are going to be checked. So practical takeaway, never take your eye off these inescapable dynamics and vulnerabilities. In some, this is my kind of deep diagnosis of what's going on now in Western liberal democracies anyway. Hyper-competitive economies, cultures, and international relations that we've got and taken for granted for a long time generate severe inequalities and precarities. That means we can start with talking about inequality and how that causes problems for democracies. But if you want to tackle inequality, you need to think about what kind of economies and cultures you need, and international relations, and how are they going to kind of create and generate new inequalities and precarities, even if you set up good institutions that regulate them. I think these are the things that really pose the deadliest threat to democracy and also to the planet. They are what create a lot of the hyper competition at all sorts of levels, is what is creating a lot of our climate emergency now. And just to kind of sum that up, I think it's really another important point to talk about democracy in this more holistic way. We so often, even those of us who know this and who've studied our sociology and our Marx and other theorists who tell us that democracy is more than just institutions, it's still very tempting to think democracy is really only about building the right institutions and making sure they're upheld. Yes, they are the basic frame. Yes, keep doing it. That's the core. But democracy is also economics. It's also cultures, values, and practices and identities that people have and that are often fostered not deliberately by anybody in particular. They're just part of its tradition, part of it's what happens on the internet, and then who's got control over it anymore? Internet and social media has really made, given a shock to older generations who said, we used to be able to kind of control the media. Now we can't control it. But internet and social media have, introduced this whole new dimension to democracy where it is often people power. So they try to, people want to harness that people power and put it into their partisan bubbles and use it for their benefit. So it's a kind of dangerous thing too, but it also has a lot of potential to do good, as you know. And global interactions are also part of democracy. I think for too long we think about, oh dear, our democracy is falling apart. And we're just thinking, we're looking inside and not realizing how much the way we deal with the rest of the world is also affecting how we deal with our own countries. And that's particularly clear in cases like Britain, or the US, where acting as a hegemonic or post-colonial power and making lots of assumptions about how we know best can also kind of create, I don't know, all sorts of hubris inside and lead people to kind of expect a bit too much in terms of their own sort of power. So just wrapping up, constant health checks, I think, is what I would recommend for all democracies, whether you're setting up a new and fragile one or trying to support a new and fragile one, or whether it's an older one. We always have to ask what cultures, economic systems, ideologies, global interactions fit with democracy. And here's some just big, long-term, vague suggestions about how to check some of the dangers in the long term. And then I'll try to give you some short-term ones and then wrap up. But yeah, I mean, inequality checking policies, we need to kind of really try to support those. Democratic political culture is really important. I think refusing to be polarized and is something that more and more of us have to kind of think about. How can you do that? And not just trying to get people over to our side, but also how can we refuse to be playing into a polarized kind of picture of democracy that many people on all sides are creating when they're under stress. That's something that I feel very strongly myself when I see people who agree with me on which side we're on broadly, but then they go too far and they really are quite exclusive and don't want to kind of talk to anymore to people who disagree with them. And finally, global policies. I mean, I think we should try to support leaders and policies that want to move away from hegemony and have a sort of more inclusive global conversation about what democracy should be. And here's some more kind of short-term practical things, but they're very vague because I'm not a policy person, as you can see. But some things we can do using existing institutions. You can push for more egalitarian regulation of markets and economies through existing institutions. Build new institutions. People's assemblies are one kind of practice that's being discussed a lot now in the US and Britain, in France, and other older established democracies, not necessarily as the substitute for, Congress and Senate and Parliament, but as kind of, an additional form of power and of deliberation, where you have kind of usually people, the most common view is people picked by lot is the way to go, a lottery, instead of having people picked by some sort of vote. But there are all kind of different proposals being made. And the other interesting concept that's coming up more and more is, should we have people's tribunals that kind of hold policymakers to account? And this is a model that's been used in various contexts after wars, that like after the Vietnam War, there was a people's tribunal was called to kind of hold policymakers into account. The policymakers themselves who made the war were not present at the tribunal, but there are increasingly calls to actually get politicians who push for policies that in kind of non-transparent ways, who push for policies that ended up causing a lot of trouble, to kind of give them an interview and give them a chance to justify themselves post facto, but also discuss, but also be kind of questioned quite toughly about, were you honest? were you really thinking about the consequences? And then, these are other things more familiar. Social movements have to be part of the democratic process. Changing minds via internet influencing, collaborative projects across partisan and other dividing lines, I think are really important to be working on right from the start. And, here's the personal side. Change your own habits of thinking about democracy. Most of you are probably much more advanced in all these ways than most people of my age, who are very, very backward, and they need to be told all this, and they blank out when you tell them this because they don't get it. Democracy is institutions and leaders, right? No, it's also you. It's also your, and I think people, I'm sure a lot of you are working on the climate issues as well in various contexts. And that's an area where suddenly personal behavior becomes very clearly linked to politics. What I do as a consumer, as a traveler, makes a big difference collectively. And finally, I mean, just think about others. We've got to, not just people who are fellow citizens, but also people outside our countries. We need each other at the moment. And this is my last slide. My last point is just, I really think we need a more global conversation about democracy. And I think that the voices of the non-Western countries should be heard and actually take the lead in many, many contexts. I don't know how we can set that up, but I think it needs to be done. Because it's people outside the now flailing Western democracies that need to ask questions about what people can do better to support democracies elsewhere. They need to ask the ones that are wealthier, the ones that have the money and the means to support them, what should we do? It shouldn't be up to the West all the time. How to democratize global financial and governance institutions, big question. And to say, like, how do you see democracy? Is it something, does it look different from where you are? And finally, welcome the young, because they tend to understand this world better than the old. Thank you. I'll just end with that and stop screen sharing. And thanks. Let's see.